Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here and joining us this afternoon. My name is Kimberly Moffitt. I serve as the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, in which it partners with the CADVC to put on programming such as this, but definitely this particular program has a special place in many of our hearts. Maurice Berger was a brilliant scholar and curator and fierce advocate for social justice. His work focused our vision on the intersections of race, inequity, and representation in visual culture. Today's event celebrates the launch of the Maurice Berger CADVC Program Fund in support of the exploration of and the research into histories of race, representation, and justice in visual culture, with the goal of creating accessible public programming that you will learn more about today. I wanted to share just a brief story that I only had the opportunity to meet Maurice once. And it was at the opening event for his exhibition For All the World to See, in which we were all extended and given the book that was associated with it. I, at the time in 2010, was a fairly close to tenure assistant professor who was here as a member of the American Studies Department and studying specifically media and race and representations. And again, had never met Maurice until this moment, but he actually sought me out to make sure that I received a copy of this book because he knew the work that I was doing. So I appreciated being acknowledged, again, as that fairly new assistant professor who was making my way, trying to figure out my way in terms of what I wanted to do in my own research trajectory, and knowing that he was someone that was in tune enough to see someone like me at the time and make sure that I was acknowledged in receiving his work and learning more about his own journey around race and representation. During today's presentations, we celebrate the launch of Race Stories, Essays on the Power of Images, a collection of award-winning essays by Maurice Berger, authored during his tenure as research professor at UMBC and chief curator at the CADVC, co-published by Aperture and the New York Times. We also are celebrating the launch of the publication of Cockeysville to Baltimore, the first CADVC activity supported by the Berger Fund. The booklet accompanies the exhibition Levester Williams, All Matters Aside, and its associated public video art projection series. We celebrate both in the reception following this program, and hopefully it's dark enough for us to see the projection, right, Rebecca? Yes, looking forward to that. We thank the Baltimore County Commission on the Arts and Sciences, the Maryland State Arts Council, and the Berger Fund Working Group, many of whom are here today celebrating with us as contributors to today's program. Aruna D'Souza, Sarah Lewis, Tim Noe, Lowry Stokes Sims, and above all, Marvin Hefferman, editor of Race Stories, and the husband of Maurice Berger, whose guidance and contributions to this initiative have been extraordinarily generous. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to the rest of the program. I will now introduce Tim Noe, Professor of Visual Arts here at UMBC.
So I have the honor of sharing some personal connections with Maurice and also introducing our speakers today. So first, my relationship with Maurice. Maurice Berger was a dear colleague and mentor, and he engaged me with curiosity, warmth, and a spirit of vibrant justice shaped by his upbringing. He grew up in a predominantly Black and Puerto Rican public housing project, and his childhood deeply influenced his writing and curating. Through confided stories, we learned that true hunger shaped us both, and we shared past struggles to thrive and create. Maurice was my mentor, encouraging risk, reach, and refinement. And in his passing, many of us became aware of the countless people who were shaped by his focus and care, and I would expect many of them are in this hall today. I'd like to address his legacy. As the CADVC embarks on this expansive and truly exciting new phase of work, I'd like to briefly highlight two key areas where Maurice's past legacy profoundly touched students, faculty, and the public. And these are in the areas of his writing and his curatorial vision. Through his curatorial work, Maurice directly engaged the UMBC community, challenging us to confront art, culture, history, and race with intellectual rigor and an open but sometimes bruised heart. The impact of Fred Wilson, Objects and Installations, White, Race, Whiteness, and Contemporary Art, and For All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights continue to resonate for this campus. I know that it was very important for Maurice to do this work at a public university and one with a majority minority student population. The publication of Race Stories, Essays on the Power of Images represents a remarkable achievement, compiling the monthly features Maurice contributed to the New York Times Lens blog between 2012 and 2019. Through these essays, Maurice wrestled with the transformational role of photography and in shaping perceptions of race, revealing how it has been reinforced and challenged racial stereotypes. And Maurice once described the process of grappling with race stories as, quote, a learning experience for me and the reader, fostering the racial and visual literacy denied me by my own teachers. Others will speak to this important work with eloquence and honesty, but as a teacher myself, I understand and deeply feel the restorative drive behind that observation. I'll now introduce the people who will be on stage and who will contribute so much to your understanding of Maurice and Maurice's legacy. First, Marvin, who has already been introduced. I would like to speak very directly here. Maurice was joined with Maurice Berger in life as his beloved spouse. Marvin's photographic Shiva, produced in the wake of Maurice's death, provided many of us with a way of grieving communally. He organizes exhibitions, online projects, and publications about photography and visual culture for institutions such as the Smithsonian Institution, ICP, International Center of Photography, and Marvin has edited numerous books, among them Race Stories, Essays on the Power of Images by Maurice Berger, which we celebrate today. And I had the opportunity to page quickly through it. It is a gorgeous publication, and I look forward to reading it. Next, Sarah Elizabeth Lewis is the founder of Vision and Justice and is the John Loeb Associate Professor of the Humanities and Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She is the author of The Unseen Truth: When Race Changed Sight in America. She is co-editor of the Vision and Justice book series, launched in partnership with Aperture and the New York Times, which published Race Stories. Aruna D'Souza writes about modern and contemporary art, intersectional feminism, and the diasporic aesthetics. Her most recent book, Imperfect Solidarities, was published in 2024. Her work appears regularly in 4 columns, the New York Times, and in numerous artist monographs and exhibition catalogs. Lowry Stokes Sims served on the education and curatorial staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1972 to 1999. As executive director and president of the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2000 and 2007, and then retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Art and Design with a tenure there from 2007 to 2015. She is a truly prolific writer, speaker, and curator, including visiting curator of Aletha Devane, Spectrum of Light and Spirit at the CADVC, which was a knockout exhibition, and was co-editor of the associating volume. Malik Glee is a cultural worker, writer, and professor based in Washington, D.C. His work explores the intersections of fine art, popular culture, and vernacular expression. In addition to a curatorial and writing practice, Malik consults with small and medium-sized institutions and corporations to better instill cultural competency and authentically engage communities in storytelling projects. He has held positions with Stable Arts, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Prince George's African American Museum. And now, Rebecca Uchel. She is the director of the Center for Art, Design, and Visual Culture, the CADVC, and professor of the practice at the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at UMBC. She is an art historian, curator, and critic of contemporary art. Now I'll return to a remark that I made earlier, and this is advice to the audience. As I remarked earlier, sometimes the images and work that Maurice Berger presented charged images that confront this nation's bruised heart. And in it, we see the searing experiences of the past and of the present. If you find the images difficult to look at, you are welcome to turn away or leave the hall. And with that, I yield the podium.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming, and thank CADVC for doing this, UMBC, and Rebecca. What I'd like to talk about very briefly is Maurice and CADVC. This is Maurice in the Adrian Piper exhibition that he organized in 1999 for CADVC that traveled to a number of museums. Maurice was affiliated with CADVC from 1992 to 2020, and over those years served as curator, senior research scholar, chief curator, and research professor. And as Tim said, working in a public university was really important to him, and he valued that and the kind of freedom that working in a university gallery situation gave him to the kind of programming that he wanted to do, which included Adrian's exhibition, a Fred Wilson retrospective in 2001, a show called White, Race, Whiteness, and Contemporary Art in 2023. Maurice valued the support from the university. This is Maurice with Freeman Hrabowski, who was president of the university until 2022. CADVC was a very tight group then. It was basically Maurice working as curator with Sims Gardner, who's here, Janet Magruder, who I don't think is here, but and Sandra Abbott, who is here, is sitting in the front. It was a very tight group that organized very, very ambitious programming. And it was programming that brought the university's name to a very different kind of audience. Maurice's shows were so provocative and innovative that they were widely recognized. So UMBC, through Maurice's work, got a national and international reputation and attention for the kind of innovative programming that they did. Shows that Maurice started here at CADVC went to the Smithsonian, the Addison Gallery of American Art, the International Center of Photography, the Jewish Museum in New York, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the Berkeley Museum of Art, the Chicago Cultural Center, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum and Research Center, whose former director Barbara Lyons is here today, which is lovely. Also, Maurice got a lot of national media for UMBC. Every time Maurice spoke, every time Maurice's work was published, he made sure that UMBC was mentioned. And so for this campus, these are the kind of places that Maurice was able to spread the word about what was going on here at the time. One of the projects that was closest to Maurice's heart was For All the World to See, which has been mentioned already. It was one of the, it was organized with its CADVC working with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. It was the third show of African American History and Culture's programming that was presented in Washington, D.C. And it was kind of a culmination of Maurice's work and interesting in terms of the kinds of material he brought together as a curator. It was a combination of artwork, popular culture, artifacts, film clips, television clips, and was widely seen. And in fact, there were 2 traveling versions of the show that the National Endowment for the Humanities put together that were on the road from 2010 to 2023. The show traveled to 48 institutions, which is kind of remarkable. This is the show at UMBC, where it was installed along the way. And after he did this exhibition, Maurice was asked to do a project for the International Center of Photography in New York. It was Gordon Parks, the 100th anniversary of Gordon Parks' birth. And so while ICP hadn't thought to put together an exhibition, they thought to ask Maurice to do a window display on 6th Avenue, which he was really interested in because public discourse was something he was interested in. And he realized when he did this that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people would see Gordon Parks' work if it was on the street on 6th Avenue and 43rd Street. Among the people who saw the show were people from the New York Times, Jim Estrin from the New York Times and David Gonzalez from the New York Times, who invited Maurice in to have lunch and suggested that he might want to write for them. And what happened was it turned into a monthly gig called Race Stories, which, as Tim mentioned, Maurice wrote from 2012 to 2019. And that is the basis of the book, which I've got a single copy of, an advanced copy of, which I'm happy to share with all of you. The book's an extraordinary book. Maurice was a terrific writer. He always thought, speaking of education, that his ideal audience were smart high school students. And while Maurice was a brilliant guy, and a beautiful writer, but also a clear one, and stayed away from jargon and made his points beautifully and clearly. And so the columns had a wide audience, which he loved. What's interesting about the project, too, is it talks about race and representation using images that stretch from the 19th century to the 20th century. And he was, of all of the work that he did, this is the work he was proudest of. I'm just going to show you two page spreads from it, just to give you a sense of what the book looks like. This was an article about Dorothea Lange photographs of Japanese internment camps. This is one of Maurice's favorite photographs of a kid in Obama's office who's looking at Obama and says, "Hey, is your hair like mine?" And Obama says, "Touch it, dude," and bends over and lets the kid do it. And Pete Souza, the White House photographer, takes a picture. Rather than speak more about Maurice, I thought it would be appropriate, since he's not here to do it, is to listen to him do it on video. So I've got a video clip from an interview with him that was done in 2018 when he won the International Center of Photography's Infinity Award for critical writing. Thank you. As I said, if you're interested in seeing the book, I've got it, so just come find me. Thank you.
Nothing like having to follow on Maurice. Thank you to to Marvin and to Rebecca for including me in today, but also just including me in the conversations about Maurice's legacy and how best to honor that legacy. I met Maurice, I'll just say to begin, I met Maurice at a gala, and it was, I think, one of the first galas that I had ever been invited to at the Curatorial Studies Center at Bard. And I was with, I came with my ex-husband, and my husband at the time, he wasn't my ex-husband at the time, but I came with my ex-husband, and we were seated at the same table as Marvin and Maurice, and Maurice took one look at my ex-husband on one side of him, and then turned around completely and totally focused his attention on me the whole night, and I have never felt more glamorous or special in my life. And our friendship was cemented when he heard that my ex and I got divorced. He called me to congratulate me. So, so I have a very special place in my heart for Maurice Berger. I was thinking of Maurice a lot last week. I was leading a writing workshop, which I don't really do because I'm not trained as a writer. I'm very much self-taught, which is always a danger. But I was leading a writing workshop for artists, and I was trying to talk about the weird part of writing, which is that you have all of this stuff in your brain and the ideas are fully formed and you can even see the words there, but actually getting them out onto paper in the same way that they exist in your brain is really hard to do. And I was thinking on the train this morning that it's kind of like when I, as an untrained photographer, try to take a photo of a sunset. And no matter what I do, it never turns out the same way that I'm seeing it in my eyes, right? Because your camera, that apparatus in the middle, that medium, is the intervening complication or factor. And the more skilled you are with a camera, the more directly the photograph can kind of reflect or communicate what you're seeing in your eyes. And I think that one of the things that Maurice was exceptionally good at is not only did he write about photography, but he himself had such a mastery of his own medium, which was that of writing, so that, and certainly I know it must have been the product of much care and much craft and much thought for him to be able to communicate his ideas in language, so with such clarity and with such beauty and with such generosity. We met around the time that, or we started spending a lot of time together around the time that I had decided to leave academia and to become a writer. And at the time, I was giving up a tenured position and as a professor, and I was doing what you weren't supposed to do. And one of the very few people to encourage me in that was Maurice. And he encouraged me because he said, you can speak to a much, well, back up. I'd started as my sort of time, the thing that I was going to spend my time on now that I was leaving academia, I'd started a food blog. And he said, and I was writing about all sorts of things, including race and diaspora and immigration and everything like that on my food blog. And he said, more people are reading and understanding what you're saying in your food blog than they ever would in your academic writing. And I was so struck by that somehow that it wasn't even the topic, it certainly wasn't the format, it was how many people could you really communicate with, and how many people could you touch, how many people could you inspire to think about the world in a different way. He was really the only person who kind of understood the value in that of the people I was surrounded with, who were very concerned that I was leaving the steady paycheck of academia for the very unsteady work of a freelancer, which of course they had a point too, but we'll leave that aside for now. Not knowing that we were going to hear Maurice very eloquently talk about his writing on this photo, I have been thinking about this photo and his writings on it very much at the moment, because the sort of perennial question I think that art critics have is, how can criticism meet the moment that we're in? And that's a question that we should be asking at every moment that we're in, but it feels especially crucial now at this moment that we're in, which is a moment of, I think, many of us feeling the cruelties of the world, especially acutely right now, which is to say those cruelties have always been there. But I feel like culturally we're at a point where we're feeling those cruelties in a kind of unique way. And I think one of the signals of the ways that we're feeling those cruelties is the reaction to yesterday's murder of the CEO of United Healthcare. And I think that both humor and the rage, or the humorous rage, of the reactions to that humor of that murder is in fact a real indication of how deeply we're feeling the cruelty of the world, and how we need some outlet in order to understand that cruelty and to talk about it. And in the face of another moment of cruelty in the world, right, which, the Charlottesville protests kind of really represented, Maurice said something very clear, which was that to ignore, dismiss, or manipulate the implications of these photographs is to further the injustices they represent. It was a call that we cannot turn away, right? We cannot turn away from what we're seeing. We cannot turn away from how the image of the world is being constructed for us at every moment that we're experiencing it, every time the world is written about, every time the world is photographed, every time those cruelties that we're experiencing are being framed for us. We have an obligation to directly face those cruelties, to face those images, to face those framings, and to unpack the ways in which those cruelties are being reframed as something else, as something natural, as something normal, as something historical, as something that's always been and always will be. Maurice passed away so tragically, so young in 2020. And as others have observed, this last election, in the lead up to the election, I think many of us were missing his voice. Maurice was very adept at political analysis and had ran a blog that analyzed polling data and sort of was determined to sort of cut through the noise and give a real snapshot of what the electorate was kind of thinking and feeling at the time. And I think that there was a great deal of, I think I missed that this time around, because I think that would have helped me at least understand what was happening around me. But in 2018, when he wrote about this photograph, he said something that struck me as I was rereading it today as so hopeful and so optimistic and so generous. And I wonder, because I read this and I thought, oh, I'm not sure that I can believe this today, even though I want to. And I wonder if he would write the same thing today. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves of because, you know, Maurice was anything but naive, but he still found a kind of moment of hope. And so I think it's worth, repeating. He said, a vast majority of Americans are good people who are clearly repulsed by what they have witnessed in the photographs of Charlottesville. But the very ordinariness of the people these images bluntly represent underscores that bigotry is not solely perpetrated at the extremes and as something exceptional. It is everywhere, having infiltrated every corner of society and culture in places and institutions on the right, left, and middle. I think the words about how deeply all of these things have infiltrated every corner of our society are very true. I hope that he's right, that a vast majority of Americans are good people who are clearly repulsed by what they see. And I will leave it at that. But thank you so much for joining us to honor this very special person who has had such a profound impact on the way that we think about and write about art.
Good evening. And I've just envisioned everyone saying good evening as if you're all with me tonight. Good afternoon, because I so want to be there with you today and really can't believe that it's impossible. But I celebrate Maurice Berger every day, as many of you do as well. This is an extraordinary occasion on which we can reflect a bit on why. I would do so differently if I were in person. I'll just offer brief remarks, which I think is the most tolerable form of sending in a video in today's day and age. What is the role of art and culture for justice in American democracy? In many ways, Maurice Berger was my North Star for understanding this idea. Our unthinkable loss and not having him made me, at least, want to do all that I can with the tools at my disposal to live out what he has taught us. Our last conversation was about a recently released book, The Unseen Truth, and the Vision and Justice Initiative. Little did he know that the answer to his question, what's next, would be him. The most recent initiative for Vision and Justice is a new book series, a publishing initiative that tells a new story of race, culture, and justice in America. The first book, the only book I felt that could be the first book in the series, is Race Stories, Essays on the Power of Images, edited by Marvin Heiferman. Maurice's work throughout his career, and specifically his courage, offer the Bible and the model we need to understand the role of art and culture for justice in our age. But we often only truly do so during times of crisis, of the kind that we found ourselves in during the racial reckoning of 2020 and the pandemic. I knew during that period that Maurice's voice is the one I most wanted to hear when we were unable to see the full stakes of the crisis for want of images initially. I knew he and I would have considered the historic and contemporary debates about the potential and the limits of images and creating empathy, for example, or offering means of understanding what we don't know about ourselves. I wrote a piece in the New York Times to honor him and thought of the foundational text that constitute his series and column, Race Stories. I knew that I would have wanted to speak to him about the impact of photographs of people affected, for example, by the Flint water crisis in Michigan, which was the start of the nationwide understanding of the unconscionable injustice uncovered by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha and illuminated by photographers such as LaToya Ruby Frazier. I knew we would have talked about and touched on the role of images during the Civil War that did far more than any reports alone could to convey the stakes and the cost of the conflict. I knew we might have thought back to the Farm Securities Administration, the FSA, with sending out photographers, as everyone in this room knows, such as Gordon Parks and Dorothea Lange, to convey the extent of the devastation from the Great Depression. He understood that images force us to contend with the unspeakable. When nothing else can, images make facts comprehensible. They often step onto the breach. To launch the Vision and Justice book series, I reached out during the pandemic after Maurice passed to Aperture. After years of labor and fundraising and vision work, I'm so thrilled to work alongside my extraordinary co-editors, Deborah Willis and Lee Rayford, the advisory board, and the director and staff at Aperture to launch the series Vision and Justice and to celebrate Maurice Berger through it. The racial regime that we live with today, that we work to undo, has put a stranglehold on American democracy. And Maurice understood that it's been secured through a transformation of vision. Maurice knew that we owe so much to the work of image makers such as Gordon Parks, Nona Faustine, Dawood Bey, who've crafted new idioms to expand our notion of who counts and who belongs in American life. He knew that in representational democracy, rights are many. Among them, though, foremost among them, is the right to be seen justly. The racial divide in American life, I know, is built on a fiction. Making a fiction real has turned our work as viewers, as judges, into daily, unheralded political acts. We're living with the consequences of not seeing this acutely enough today, but Maurice Berger always knew. He always knew this work was deadly serious and he would take up arms with anyone who didn't understand it. He never underestimated the work of critics and scholars and writers and lens-based, in particular artists of color, whose work has been so vital for the work of American democracy. He identified what makes this book, Race Stories, so urgent, that a critical, unfinished part of the history of race and representation is that of audience. He wanted to ensure that those within the so-called art world and those, most importantly, really beyond it, understood race through pictures today and the work that pictures have performed to dislodge racial stereotypes over time. As he put it, racial literacy could come from visual literacy, and Race Stories is a primer. Each essay models how this is done. I'm so grateful to Aperture and to the staff of the New York Times for publishing this volume. I'm grateful to my colleagues, Deborah Willis and Lee Rayford. I'm grateful too to Agnes Gund and Darren Walker, who so generously contributed the funds to make Race Stories possible. I'm grateful most, though, to Maurice Berger's widow, my dear friend, Marvin Heiferman. I am, along with two other friends, what we call ourselves, daughters in Maurice, to Marvin. I want to thank Marvin for his friendship, and I want to celebrate with you all today Maurice's legacy. Thank you.
So I met Maurice at the graduate art history program at CUNY in the 1980s. We were among the program's early cohorts, and our peers included Benjamin Buchloh and Abigail Solomon-Godot. Maurice impressed me immediately. He was contrary, convincing, and scarily brilliant. So today I wanted to touch briefly on what I've learned from Maurice and how his thought has affected my reading of art, and using as the inspiration two exhibitions, Race and Representation, which was presented at Hunter College in New York City in 1987, and Whiteness and Race in Contemporary Art, presented here at UMBC in 2004. I was a co-curator for the first and wrote an essay, and the second one was an important resource for me when I taught a course in 2018. Maurice opened his 1987 essay for Race and Representation with Norman and Norma, two statues that were exhibited at the American Museum of Natural History in 1945. His opening center is a kicker. His tall, well-portioned body is graceful and athletic. His face, with its square jaw and high cheekbones, is perfectly symmetrical. He is once average and ideal, a composite of available data translated into 3 dimensions, a model of normal perfection. His name is appropriately Norman, and along with his perfect sister, Norma, he stands as a testament to the character of the American nationality. So we know that the proportions of Norman were based on statistics from World War I artists, and Norma from data gathered from 1,500, which is described as native white women from the Bureau of Home Economics. For Maurice, this timing of this project was ridiculous, coming almost immediately after what he described, the psychotic enterprise of the Nazi geneticists who searched for statistics to prove their claims of Aryan superiority and beauty. 30 years ago, I further researched Norman and Norma in relationship to societal ideas of standardization and the mean. I recalled former Library of Congress librarian Daniel Borstein's discussion in his books on American people about how the standardization of sizes in clothing were created for efficient and effective production of uniforms during the Civil War. And then the system was then civilianized for men's apparel. It's interesting to note that the unveiling of Norman and Norma precipitated a national competition to find the living equivalent of Norma. But standardization of clothing for women did not happen until the 1940s and 50s, and again, from some strange statistical data, not certainly collected from the likes of me or my family. Just to show Maurice's influence on and synchronicity with these ideas, I'll mention that the subject of standardization was occupied artists such as John Quick-to-See Smith, whose 1992 The Red Men self-portrait took on Leonardo da Vinci's The Vitruvian Man of 1492. As noted on the Women's Studio website, she substituted her own body to subvert the idea that all things are to be measured by European standards and translated geometry into indigenous terms, replacing the circle and the square with the machine, wheel, and symbol of the 4 directions. Her own bodily presence asserts, "I am here, we have survived." And then in 1994, Renee Green done prosthesis to evoke the body of the South African Kakoya woman, Sarje Bartman, the so-called Hottentot Venus, who was brought to England, where she was gawked at, exposed like a carnival attraction, and finally dissected after her death. Ironically, her physique has been suggested as the source of fashion later in the 19th century. Cox's intervention is therefore, quote, "a powerful statement about savage racism, colonialization, the historic denigration of the other, as she rescues the ideal of beauty that is a pointed declaration of freedom from the tyranny of standardization of criteria for female beauty. But there's more. At a time when makeup choices for Black women were not standardized, my sister, the ballerina, had to search out Max Factor's dark Egyptian makeup which was created for Lena Horne. But then I found out Hollywood deployed the makeup to make white women look darker, so then that really impinged on film opportunities for black actresses. And then the fact that my Catholic high school in the 1960s mandated flesh-colored stockings as part of the uniform meant wearing a color geared for white skin that made one look like one had a skin condition. So we admired the classmate who wore black stockings to school one day, declaring to the nuns that for her, that was a flesh color. But I digress. Let's go back to race and representation. And I want to, as Tim has said, I want to alert you that I'm going to show some images now featuring lynchings, but they're germane to the work on the exhibition I'm going to discuss. In our various discussions, I realized that Maurice invariably focused on the notion of responsibility. His discussion of Pat Ward Williams' piece, Accused, Blowtorch, Padlock, highlights the artist's strategy of interrogating our collective responsibility as onlookers to this image, as well as to the motivation of Life magazine in publishing this image. Maurice wrote, Williams scrawls some difficult questions about the morality of life's concerned representation. For example, who took this picture? Life answers, page 141, no credit. Couldn't he have just as easily let the man go? How could this photograph exist? The litany of questions continues as Williams weaves a painful web of indictments, end quote. This in turn illuminates Kerry James Marshall's strategy in his 2002 Heirlooms and Accessories, where he turns the gaze back onto the spectators of the lynching of Abe Smith, 18 years old, Thomas Shipp, 19 years old, on August 7th, 1930, in Marion, Indiana, before a crowd that was estimated at 5,000 people, including women and children. This time, we know it was a local photographer, Lawrence Belter, who took this photograph, and it is said he sold thousands of copies of the photographs after the lynching. As we can see in the upper right, Marshall, as described in the Studio Museum website, fades the original image and highlights the faces of the three women in the crowd to the left, who are described as accessories to the murders, and places each one of them inside a locket, which is an accessory. He alludes to the legacy of racism by turning them into heirlooms, passed down from generation to generation. In his introductory essay, Invisible Man, An Introduction to Whiteness, for the exhibition Catalog for Whiteness in Contemporary Art, Maurice references sociologist and cultural critic Sander Gilman, who documented how in the 19th century chromatics, skin color, assumed associations of ideals of blacks and whites with negative and positive traits that buttressed scientific racism, licentiousness versus charity, primitive versus civilized, etc. Maurice writes about this work by Barbara Kruger in this exhibition that, quote, the phrases that Barbara lays over the image allude to many things, such as sensitivity to attack or criticism, irritation, shallowness, sex, or violence. Now, I think it's been alluded to how Maurice always noted how his white skin afforded him an advantage over the black and brown people among whom he grew up. But he also reminds us that whiteness does not always afford white people equal authority or status. It connotes multiple meanings, multiple ethnicities, multiple skin colors. Indeed, whiteness, like blackness, is at best an imprecise racial category. So I think this is Shades of the Paintings by Byron Kim, literally. And lastly, Oh, it's not been advancing. Byron Kim. And lastly, this is all captured in Bob Colescott's 1984-85 Beta series, along the lines of Maurice's thinking. We see in these two paintings how the rescue of a white woman into a black and brown populated locale leads to a rather dramatic disruption of the self-image and the sense of balance among the indigenous women. I'm not doing justice to all these images in such an abbreviated time, but I wanted to make the point that I've appreciated Maurice Berger as a like-minded ally and fellow traveler in the journey towards untangling race and gender in art and in our world. As he suggested in, quote, Invisible Man, an Introduction to Whiteness, quote, the end of racism will be possible only after we find a way to see whiteness, to name it in order to examine it, and only then can we begin to understand the ways we deny humanity and worth of people we too often rather not see. Thank you.
I did not have the honor and privilege of meeting Maurice Berger, but I am quite honored to be here today to talk about how reading his work and viewing only pictures of his exhibitions have informed my life and journey as a cultural worker. I think it's quite befitting that I'm going right after Dr. Lowry and considering the idea of standardization, and Maurice Berger presenting himself as someone who had all benefits of standardization, but took it upon himself to break that mold, to queer our worldview, and to provide new methods of viewing not only contemporary art, photography, but also showing us how these things are interwoven. So I'm going to begin with sharing that Maurice Berger is a lighthouse and constant footnote in my journey as a cultural worker. His scholarship expresses an awareness in a myriad of cultural arenas that help us widen our visual interpretation strategies and thus widen our worldviews. To become less homogenistic, less mimetic and prone to a quick assumption toward the dominant cultural understanding. To make tangible the value of art and culture in our everyday lives. His scholarship may, and I believe should, inform how the cultural arena engages with the ideas and concepts of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. He had writ about these strategies nearly 2 decades before they became commonplace in contemporary culture in the early 2020s. And his strategies not only contend with racial difference, but do acknowledge intercommunal differences, giving depth to what can be seen as quite flat and representational. It is this intercommunal difference that acknowledges the autonomous and improvisational, expressions, those that are more accurately reflecting the world without a dominant hierarchy, and understand that many live without adherence to dominant hierarchical structures. I want to point to how I was first met with Maurice Berger as a student at Goucher College, not too far from here, where I studied their unique cultural sustainability program. I decided to pursue cultural sustainability because it provided cultural solutions to real-world problems, and it really gave voice and validated that culture has function in our everyday lives. Through an ethical lens, the program taught me to look at issues of globalization, censorship, cultural erasure, and how these would relate to the public sector, presenting interwoven challenges of economics, social justice, and educational access, all of which were topics of discussion through Maurice's career as a writer and critic. It is in this program that I was introduced to Maurice Berger through his landmark essay, Our Art Museum's Racist, published in the September 1990 issue of Art in America. And here I will begin with an artwork and an essay that typifies Maurice Berger's in-depth ability to connect art to to reflect an industry and our world at large. Here we see A Fan, a work by David Hammonds that was presented in Strange Attractions, Signs of Chaos in the 1989 exhibition at the New Museum. The installation features the muffled voice of Malcolm X on loop as he bemoans his transgressions with white Americans, but most specifically of the empty lip service of white liberals towards Black liberation. Here we see a mannequin of a white woman bust, quite stagnant and fixed, unable to react to the constantly moving and muffled voice of one of our most pronounced American political figures, Malcolm X. And similarly is the catalog of the exhibition being quite stagnant in its ability to relate to Malcolm X statements, not giving it and affording it a proper intellectual seriousness. Here we see, and I think this reflects how Blackness exists in contemporary art spaces, that the object itself has served as enough. It checks off a list. It gives us the right to say that we are practicing DEI strategies without affording an intellectual seriousness to what is being said by the artwork or from the artists themselves. These works help us position Blackness in the contemporary arena. Often visibility is unmet with a voice that may disrupt the status quo, the racialized expectancy, and point toward an independent philosophical posture. Visibility has become enough to represent, albeit absent, of the intellectual inner life. Throughout his essay, we see the emergence of DEIA strategies, and even to a broader extent to those that are employed now. Maurice Berger suggests, which I think is of utmost importance, that white institutions look towards the smaller legacy affinity spaces. These institutions should be positioned, he argues, as experts, and not always in relationship to a white institution from an extractive point of view. That white audiences should travel to institutions such as the Studio Museum in Harlem, such as Mokada in Brooklyn, such as Howard University, all of which have helped build myself, my worldview, and my career. What I find unique about this essay and its strategies towards the EIA is that they reflect a cohort of Black artists, in the early 1970s, who wrote several essays in their book, Black Art Notes, one of which, authored by artist Tom Floyd, gives several recommendations to white cultural organizations. He raises the question about white cultural dominance in the capital of attention, and that these spaces, again, these Black affinity spaces, should be deemed experts and not extracted by the already economically and culturally dominant white institutions. It is my fear that our current understandings of DEIA discredit, dismiss, and materially compromise such legacy institutions who have operated outside of white viewership due to historic barriers of violence and ongoing psychological barriers. These institutions do not merely represent a community to itself, but they embody their epistemological foundations, such as the social etiquettes which imbue political postures of collectivism. These institutions are in the arena of interpretation, such as the curatorial and museum, the editorial and journalism, the policy and the political. All of these frame our worldviews and create either a wider or more condensed aperture. I move here to a work of artist Tom Lloyd, who was one of the editors and contributors to Black Art Notes. This work was included in the inaugural exhibition of the Studio Museum in Harlem, of which both Tom Lloyd and Maurice Berger prioritize and celebrate as being emblematic of cultural progress. This light sculpture was met with controversy when it was debuted, as the audience expected this Black institution to foreground or promote figurative works and or works that were overtly political in their visuality. But I believe that the Studio Museum's gesture to promote Tom Lloyd's light sculptures was quite political, as it made clear the museum's intention to serve as a nexus of artists of African descent. Blackness in the US and abroad has been relegated to social function to serve as a litmus of humanitarian progress, which often renders the interiority and the attention towards a holistic life of philosophical and aesthetic sensibilities and curiosities null. It is the work of artists such as Tom Lloyd and the writings such as Maurice Berger that gives life and texture to the interior lives of Black Americans. During that similar period, documenting and talking about that similar civil rights period, Maurice Berger's 2010 exhibition, All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights, he gives attention to Black interiority and the limited interpretation strategies of which Black culture has been afforded. In the section, Inner Lives, We Are Whole, the images of everyday life, he looks at Black popular media and its dual function. Most specifically, he cites the 1955 issue of Jet magazine, which made clear to the world the brutal murder of Emmett Till. And for white audiences, this was their introduction to Jet. And they met the publication with the understanding that it had a political function. But Maurice Berger widens that aperture and the function of the magazine to show that that issue and that article and those images of Emmett Till were just a slice of a whole, that Jet magazine served a larger purpose. Its purpose was to celebrate, document, and serve as a public forum for discussion of all things lifestyle, to include beauty, aesthetics, fashion, culture, economics. It created an insular vehicle for intercommunal conversation. Considering the new directions, I want to look towards a cohort of artists and scholars who approach the cultural production and documentation regard those who have been deemed marginal center amongst themselves. That art need not be reactive, oppositional, relational to dominant systems, insidiously infirming their domination and continuing a pathology of intellectual servitude. I offer a quote from artist and writer Kevin Quashie, whose book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Black Culture Beyond Resistance, offers new strategies of visual interpretation and pushes against the expectancy of an outward function of Black culture and its people. On the concept of quiet, he shares, we can become a little aware of the ways that we tend to understand and interpret Blackness. Interpretations that are pretty unconscious and that have made Black culture, not only from within, but from outside of it, reactive to whiteness. For example, resistance. Resistance is so readily identifiable with Black culture. It is common sense notion that Black culture is expressive, dramatic, and even defiant. Characterizations that all point to a notion of resistance. Resistance is such a powerful idiom in how we think about Black culture that it's often nearly unconscious. It is a natural assumption. Other theorists who present new directions beyond resistance, toward new interpretation strategies and progressing cultural canonical understandings beyond what has been deemed legitimate through previous scholarship and other modes of cultural documentation include Legacy Russell, Candace Williams, Darby English, and many, many others. In my closing, I want to look at two works of art from two contemporary artists, the first being Lauren Housley. Lauren's work, often in immersive installations, takes a look at Los Angeles and includes constant visualities across the African diaspora. In this work, we see an archive and aesthetic sensibilities through graphic design, typography, through advertisements, political media, and other inferior of urban locales. They document in museum collections the autonomous communities and modes of communication. In this particular work, we see Malcolm X not only as a stagnant figure, as he was expressed in David Hammond's A Fan, but engaged as a constant thread throughout the African diaspora. His image can be found in homes, in churches, and in schools as a symbol of aspirational masculinity and a self-interested politic. I'll close with E. Jane's 2016 Nope Manifesto. In my reading of Maurice Berger's work, it seems as if he was aware of the Nope landscape. He did not use his occupation as a writer and his proximity to communities of color as a voyeur or as an intruder, but rather as a mediator, as someone who understood and respected the Nope and made it clear and plain to his white peers that there was an alternative way of viewing and living and thinking. And unfortunately, it's not on my slide, so I will turn closer to the slide to read the Nope Manifesto. I am not an identity artist simply because I'm a Black artist with multiple selves. I am not grappling with notions of identity and representation in my art. I am grappling with safety and futurity. We are beyond asking if we should be in the room. We are in the room. We are also dying at a rapid pace and need a sustainable future. We need more people, we need better environments, and we need places to hide. We need utopian demands, and we need a culture that loves us. I am not asking who I am. I am a Black woman and expansive in my Blackness and in my queerness, as Blackness and queerness are already expansive. None of this is as simple as identity and representation beyond the colonial gaze. I reject the colonial gaze as the primary gaze. I am outside of it in the land of Nope. And I want to close here with E. Jane's manifesto because I believe that through his scholarship, Maurice Berger embraces the Nope landscape. And that again, he, and in rare form, bemoans and almost subdues his privilege to afford the interiority to Black artists using Black popular culture, journalistic media, and fine art to show the interior lives of Black Americans. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Uchel. I'm the director of the CADVC, and I'm overwhelmed by the program that we've experienced so far. I just would like to first thank all of our speakers. Thank you so much. This program has really been, for me, and I suppose for others as well, just an extraordinary testimony to the profundity of art and visual culture and its discussion and its scholarship and its production in raising so many different kinds of ideas, interrogations, and also feelings. I want to acknowledge my feelings in this moment, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that this has been a profoundly moving day so far, and CADVC and I are really honored to host this convening. I want to thank, in addition to some of the people that have been thanked already, I want to specifically thank our team, Andrew Leung, Mercedes Lopez, Sandra Abbott, and Adam Dronberg for the work they've done to organize this event today, and also our event services team, especially Zach Gutzweiler and Valentine Amicelli for the work that they've done to support this event today. So thank you, as well as the speakers who I've already mentioned. We're celebrating a lot today. We are terrifically excited about the launch of the Maurice Berger CADVC Program Fund, which you heard about in the introduction. This program fund will support the legacy of this scholarship and particularly the commitment to public accessible programming that was a hallmark of Maurice Berger's work. Some of that programming is already here right now because we are also launching the first activity, the first publication in the series of activities that will be funded by that fund, and that is the publication of Cockeysville to Baltimore, which is the booklet that accompanies Levester Williams's projection work Michelle D. Wright is in the audience today. Michelle, can you raise your hand? She is the essayist who wrote for this publication, and she will have a few words to share with us when we do a toast in the reception area immediately following this event. We are also announcing the relaunch of the Issues in Cultural Theory imprint, which Maurice Berger edited, and it is our intention to relaunch this as a hybrid imprint. This has been something that we've been working on at CADVC in the service of accessible programming, that all of our print publications are also open access, downloadable publications, open and available for free to the general public. And I want to emphasize that we are also publishing this as a free publication, and everyone will leave today with a copy, I hope. We also want to acknowledge, though we only have one hard copy book, Marvin, can you hold that up? It's this very coveted book of race stories. It's gorgeous. You can pre-order, or at this moment, I suppose, order the book, and there's a way to do that if you go out to the gallery following this event during our reception. There's a QR code that will allow you to purchase the book. We also have CADVC books for sale. And I am obligated to share that we also have a small survey that CADVC student gallery attendants would like to invite you to participate in if you enter the gallery. Please see one of those attendants to take the survey if you don't mind. With that, I've been informed that Dr. Lowry Stokes Sims has entirely switched up the plan for how the discussion was going to follow now. So here's what I think is going to happen, but I'm sure I'm going to be wrong about this. I think we've got about 15 minutes, because we don't want to stand in between the wine and the people's desires here, but we also don't want to not have the discussion because it's too important. We're going to invite, what are we going to do, Lowry? Yeah. Okay. Lowry, please forgive me, but for the people that are experiencing our captioning software today, I'm going to say it on mic too. So we're going to forego sitting on the chairs today, but the speakers will come up and stand at the front of the stage. I'm going to bring you your microphones and convene a little bit more of an intimate setting. Is that about right? Okay, great. So I will walk those microphones over to you right now. Great.
Towards the center. I'm not fooling around here. We got 15 minutes to have profound discussions.
Our AV people are going to kill me probably.
Okay. All right. Okay, this, yeah.
You're imagining?
This is it.
Okay, great.
So we're getting it. All right, I think that, the thing that really sort of comes through in all the discussions today, to those of us who knew Maurice. There you go. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. I think what's clear from all the discussions today of people who knew Maurice in various ways, that, as I said in my comments, that he always was interested in the whole idea of the responsibility of witnessing. And I think that it really strikes me because the words from the Pat Ward Williams piece, you see this lynch body, you took a photograph of it, why didn't you take it down? And we have the same thing today with our iPhones. We see something happening, and it seems more important for us to capture it and post it rather than to intervene and prevent it. So I just want to know and have some idea about, first from our panel and then from you all, about what are our responsibilities today as we're going through the world witnessing, and how do we sort of like really mediate between capturing something and intervening?
I'll start. Maurice died in March 2020, and when George Floyd was murdered, I was watching TV and people were continually calling me up saying, what would Maurice say? What would Maurice think? And I was watching the role of imagery and how imagery made that a transformative moment in culture. And I think, Lowry, it kind of speaks to what you're saying in terms of putting images out in public. It's kind of what Sarah Lewis was talking about too, I think. I think it's a hugely important thing. I think it's why Maurice's work that's why he liked public institutions rather than private ones. It's why he liked big museums and doing shows at places like the Smithsonian rather than at small elitist kind of places. I think it's why he loved having the opportunity to do that New York Times work, because it meant that every month tens of thousands of people were reading something. It's something that Aruna was talking about too. And I think witnessing is a tremendous thing, and it's also power. I mean, what Maurice was most interested in was self-representation, and that's what fascinated him in his work. And when he did exhibitions, he would always include snapshots that people made. You know, often would do that just to let people kind of take control of their own images and the dialogue around those images. So I think witnessing was central to what he did, and we can all do it now in different kind of ways. And I think the dialogue has changed around imagery and race and representation, at least to a certain extent.
Right.
A little bit.
You want to say?
I was just going to say, I think like one of the things that I find really interesting, I have a constant sort of running argument with Maurice in my head about empathy and about how, you know, Maurice was so committed to the idea that one could look at a photograph in the way, you know, that he looks at Gordon Parks's photographs and say these are moments of identification, opportunities for identification, right? Opportunities for empathetic identification. And I have become more and more cynical about empathy as I've gotten older, and about the ways in which people get comfortable with the idea that all they have to do is be empathetic, which I don't think is what Maurice wanted, right? Empathy was, you know, empathy might have to sort of precede action, but the action was still important. And for Maurice, I think the action, a lot of it was the action of not just seeing or consuming the image, but actually deconstructing the image and analyzing the image and understanding how the image gained its power, right? So that witnessing was, or maybe the different way of putting it is that the way that I would put it is that for Maurice, witnessing was an extremely active responsibility, right? That it wasn't just the passive consumption of something or just the standing by, but actually taking apart what we were seeing and understanding the stakes of what we were seeing and understanding how these images were producing something beautiful in the world or reproducing something horrible in the world. And I think that was the power of his writing, is that witnessing was not just a responsibility to witness, but witnessing was a form of responsibility to action. And that, I think, is so, to me, the continuing challenge of his work. because I say I don't want to wait for anyone to be empathetic for me, to treat me as a human in the world, and I don't want anyone to have to wait for me to be treated as a human in the world, right? To wait for me to develop my empathy. But Maurice's challenge even went beyond empathy, I think, even when he used that language, and that was the obligation to act, right, in response to that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm wondering, we have lived, at least in the last 50 years, in probably the most media-saturated world that we can. I wonder if someone here would like to share their experience of an image or photograph that particularly moved them and tell us why. Yes.
Hello. I'm going to answer that, and I also wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
I think there were multiple images that really radicalized me this past year, given the genocide in Gaza. And I'm, waiting for someone to mention that as we talk about witnessing and just all of the things. And so I'm curious, my question for you all is, how would Maurice respond to what's been happening for the past year, specifically the way that TikTok was used to kind of radicalize a new generation and introduce them to the power of witnessing, empathy, just the things? Answer and question.
I suspect Marvin will have more to say, that from my conversations with Maurice, that his reaction over the past year will have been a complicated one. But I do think that, again, I think of Maurice's call to all of us in relation to Fred Moten's observation that there's a difference in declaring oneself in solidarity and being in solidarity, and that again is the question is always what one does when one sees those images, right? What the actual aftermath of is in action. But I'll just leave it at that.
I think it's hard to sort of, predict what someone's going to say if they're not here. However, I was always struck by the fact that, like Maurice and I grew up in New York, and there are certain profiles that you expect out of New Yorkers of certain kinds of ethnic backgrounds and sort of economic stances. And he sort of defied everything that I had been taught about what it meant to be a Jewish person in New York City. He was poor. He grew up, like in a sort of integrated, like neighborhood. Well, I don't know if it's integrated since he was the only one, so. But the fact that he sort of recognized that at the same time he had privilege because his skin presented white, that presentation of white did not necessarily translate into the kind of privilege and power that we think it does, and that is being projected as doing. So I think that in terms of what he would say about the situation in Israel and Gaza, is that from each person's perspective, we're not getting a sense of introspective and sort of like sensibilities of what it is to sort of be in each other's place. And it's complicated because of arms, money, politics, natural resources. And I think most of all, Maurice would be thinking about the people on both sides who are troubled and victimized by the situation?
I couldn't say specifically. As I mentioned earlier, everybody for years was saying, what would Maurice say? What would Maurice say? And at one point, I kind of threw up my hands on Instagram, where I'd been posting pictures every day about Maurice's death and grief and photography and issues about that, and saying, I can't deal with this anymore. And Deb Willis came up with a really good answer. She said he said it all, just let people read what Maurice wrote. So I don't know what he would do. What I do know is Maurice was very, very, very careful about what he said and how he said it and where he said it. And Maurice never spoke about race in public, ever. Maurice wrote, and Maurice appeared in videos and would be interviewed and knew that you had to be very, very careful about what you said and how you said it. So I don't know what he would have done, and I don't know what he would have said, and I don't know where he would have said it. But he would have been thoughtful, and I think, as Lowry was suggesting, it would have been about people ultimately. So yeah, I don't know what more to say. But the empathy thing is actually interesting, because when I was listening to the video, when I looked at it the first time, and I listened, and he said that word, I thought, huh? Yeah, I know. Huh? Because I think what he was about was criticality and self-criticality and critical thinking. So, yeah, hard to know. I don't know.
Anybody else have any ideas, any comments? Don't have? Oh, Letha, thank you.
I feel like there's something missing in the conversation that really begins to talk about Maurice's growing up and the community that he grew up in. And so if you're talking about an integrated community and people knowing each other, that seems to be a missing component in this conversation too. And you can't know anybody by being distant or outside of their community. So I'm here because I really believe that in reading his books, he was so clear about not only who he was, but how, if we're talking about empathy, it moved beyond empathy. It was more about involvement with people.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think about when I think about Maurice. So.
It's a very perceptive comment, and as during today's presentation, I'm always conscious about people looking at Maurice saying, he's a white guy, why is he writing about this? And that was always not so much an issue, but it would come up from time to time. And I think his experiences growing up were very much about that. What he says in the video, he was hanging around with his friends. He got to hear things that people said that nobody else might have heard, that other people didn't hear. I remember very well Maurice being told by a colleague, a very well-known, very respected curator, why are you writing about black people? Why are you writing about gay people? And Maurice was horrified for exactly the reason you're talking about. It's because he talked to people, and that was a huge part of his way of being in the world and communicating with people. And I think it's exactly what you're saying. So empathy kind of lets you sit back and look at a picture and say, oh, too bad, right? That's too bad. But that's not kind of what he was saying. And
Exactly.
That's when in that video he says, I want people to ask themselves, what am I doing to hurt somebody? That might hurt somebody. That's kind of what it was like. And so he would really connect with people in that kind of way. And I think in the writing, he went out of his way to do that too, to kind of make arguments, be very rigorous. He was a very rigorous, critical person, but loved people and wanted people to talk. Yeah, so it speaks directly to what you're talking about.
Can I, if you don't mind, I want to jump in with something that Maurice wrote to me, actually. in November 2019, actually, and I had taken part. I had accepted an invitation on to a panel that I realized as I was sitting on the stage that I had no business taking part in. And it was, I came to writing about questions of race very late in my career. And so, Maurice was a real, model for me in the sense of me being a non-Black person writing about anti-Black racism. And I, accepted this invitation. I realized that I really shouldn't have. I really should have said no. I don't have the chops for this. And I wrote to Maurice the next day to say, I did something really stupid and I'm feeling bad about it. And he said, and this is what he wrote back to me. He said, I understand the questions you're asking yourself. I grappled with the same questions. Keep in mind, sometimes it's not necessary to figure this out quickly. I honestly do not feel that I found my voice until I published White Lies in 1999, no less with an experimental memoir that caused a media stir. I was 43 when White Lies was published. It was tumultuous and I was scared to death. But the experience was so clarifying. I kicked art history to the side, turned fully to cultural and social social history and criticism, and rejected with kindness my white mentors, Rosalind Krauss and Linda Nochlin, who was also my mentor. But here's the thing, I still struggle with where I want my voice to be heard. The Times was perfect, but now we are at the very least on hiatus, and I'm really not sure of my next steps at 63. My way of saying, you do not need to make this decision now. In a funny way, the flow of your immediate career may make that long-term decision for you. It's good to say yes to as many offers as possible, except public speaking, and see where the intellectual tide takes you. And then he complimented me about something, and then that's fine. But I still go back to this email. Anyway, and it's making me tear up now. I'm sorry if I...
Well, I just think we have to wrap this up, but I want you to think about a photograph in your life that it stirred you to an action. Thank you.
So we are wrapping it up here, but we're not wrapping it up totally because we have food and drink outside. After we say goodbye here, I'll invite the speakers to stay for one moment for a quick photograph and invite everyone else to head out and have some food and drink. We'll have a quick word from Michelle Wright about the Cockeysville to Baltimore book when we toast in this atrium space. The projection work that Levester Williams organized with, now that I don't have the spotlight in my face, I can say artists Sheila Gaskins and Nia Hampton, who are featured in that projection work, are right here with us. Those are live in the blustery courtyard, which we had not anticipated being quite so wintry when we organized this, but it is. So they are visible from the CADVC windows as well. The gallery is open. Please stay and tour the exhibition. And with that, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to all the speakers. And we will see you in our reception.